This FedGov Today program is sponsored by Interos and Carasoft. On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, the Navy and Marine Corps take their budget requests to Capitol Hill. The Pentagon gets serious about the defense industrial base's supply chain and executing the vision for America's warfighting Navy. Welcome to FedGov Today with Francis Rose. The Navy and Marine Corps are taking their budget requests and the reasoning behind them to Capitol Hill. The Secretary of the Navy, Carlos Del Toro, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Erik Smith, testified about the budget request before the House Appropriations Committee this week. All three will go before the Senate Appropriations Committee on Tuesday. At the Navy League's Sea Air Space Conference this week, Undersecretary of the Navy Erik Raven tells me about the main things the Navy and Marine Corps will emphasize in the budget request.
First of all, readiness. The Department of the Navy Marine Corps team provides ready forces all around the world, ready to deter and, if necessary, fight anywhere in the world on a moment's notice. Next, after that, is people. We have to look after our people if we're going to succeed in any of our missions. That's not just about readiness and training. That's about looking after the whole individual. That's looking after families. So we have some really important quality of life initiatives built into the 2025 budget. That includes everything from looking after barracks to increasing support to military families, helping with childcare, and so much else. When warfighters go overseas, they depend on their families being taken care of. And our 2025 budget really advances the ball on that front. And finally, I would say our relationship with industry is incredibly important. This budget has significant investments into the submarine industrial base, and those really help support one of our key warfighting advantages, and that is the undersea. Between the U.S. need for submarines and our working with our two closest allies, the United Kingdom and Australia, to implement Orcas, the undersea is incredibly important. Frankly, we're not where we need to be on some of those initiatives, but we have more than $15 billion of spending planned to work with industry to produce the undersea capabilities that we need.
One of the things that came up on the Chiefs panel this morning with the CNO and with the ACMAC was the integration of the Marine Corps and the Navy. Why is that important to drive tighter integration between those two services in your view, and what do you see in the budget that will drive that?
So every day I go to work and work with the Secretary of the Navy, the CNO, and the Commandant to deliver capabilities that make a difference in the joint force. And what I can say with great amount of pride is that the Navy and Marine Corps have never been more aligned on their mission. Just look at the investments in the 2025 budget. We've committed to 31 amphibious ships. We're moving forward with the light amphibious warship, which is a key capability for the Marine Corps in the Indo-Pacific. And we're also integrating on a lot of other capabilities. Think about unmanned and replicator, where the Navy and Marine Corps are really leading the Department of Defense's embrace of this new initiative to field new technologies on an operationally relevant time frame.
Technology obviously drives a lot of what we're seeing in this room and a lot of what the sailors and Marines use in the field. How have you seen that evolve over time, and what do you see in the budget that supports where the Navy wants to go technologically?
So agility and technology go hand in hand. And so from the Department of the Navy, we are looking at opportunities like Replicator, where the Navy and Marine Corps can tee up some of the most interesting, most promising technologies, not just to investigate and advance them, but to field them at operationally relevant timeframes. So looking to these new technologies and how to get them in the hands of the warfighters faster is one area where the services and the department are very much collaborating and moving things forward. Very excited about the creation of the Disruptive Capabilities Office in the Navy. The DCO is really meant to take learning from a lot of promising initiatives that we've had. Look at Task Force 59 in the Central Command area of operations, where we've been able to work with industry, field technologies, experiment, and learn from them very quickly. The Disruptive Capabilities Office is taking learning like that and being able to solve for all sides of the Rubik's Cube. How do we make use of new technologies in an operational setting? How do we contract for them? How do we budget for them? And how do we sustain them? And the DCO will be solving for all sides of that Rubik's Cube puzzle to make sure we're making the best out of new technologies.
The budget includes a lot of detail on platforms and where you would like to invest in platforms. A lot of discussion at this show about shipbuilding and delays and all of that. What do you take away from that discussion, and what do you see as the way that you and your colleagues as leaders in the Navy can try to change the trajectory that some of these programs are on, sir?
So the Secretary of the Navy in January directed a 45-day review of our shipbuilding portfolio. We've just briefed that out to Congress. We've had media engagements, and we're welcome to discussions from all takers on the lessons from that important review. That review was really focused on where are we today, and what it found was that we are behind on several critical programs. This is a status report of where we are, and we are building the case of where we need to go. Some of the lessons that came out of that review are not surprising. One lesson was that first-of-class ships can be very challenging to build on the schedule that we want them to be built. Anybody who's been watching Navy shipbuilding for years understands that's been a challenge that is not new. Where we need to go with that review is being able to take those lessons where we have not performed well and turn them into an action plan to make sure that we are retaining the lessons that everybody knew, uncovering the new lessons to get ahead of the next generation of challenges, and start implementing those reforms in a very accountable way. And so the 45-day review was the first step in this process, and we're going to be following up and pulling every lever to make sure we can perform better on our key shipbuilding programs.
How would you and Secretary Del Toro, Secretary Girton judge the way that you're moving forward on that a year from now, 2 years from now, and so on, to see that whatever action you're taking today as a result of that 45-year plan drives you in the direction that you want to go?
So that's a unique thing about the shipbuilding portfolio, is you don't see results right away. It takes almost 9 years to build a Virginia-class submarine. It takes several years to build a destroyer. It takes a little bit more than a decade to build an aircraft carrier. And so the time scales that we're dealing with means that we will not necessarily know within the next weeks or months if we're pulling the right levers. But what we can do is hold ourselves accountable. And that means being able to understand the plan moving forward and have a robust system in place to make sure that we are not just learning, but we are implementing the learning that we have today, and that will set us up for success over the long term.
Regarding learning, what do you learn when you come to an event like this, see the vendors? I know they have things that they want to say, they want to show you and all of that. How do you budget your time, I suppose, to make sure that you can take something back to the Pentagon that will be useful to share with you and your colleagues?
These events are always very exciting because it's a great platform to share the vision of where the Department of the Navy is going and how our warfighters fit in with the joint force and how they're making a difference all across the world. And so it's great to be able to deliver those messages to such a diverse audience. But in terms of listening, it's also really exciting to meet with the exhibitors here. They show exciting technologies, the breakthroughs that are on the precipice of making their way out into the fleet and making a difference in the real world. But also I very much value the ability to have a candid dialogue on what are the challenges as these exhibitors work with the Department of the Navy. And I hear feedback that, contracting could do better. Why can't we have more in the budget for X, Y, and Z? Those are all great conversations, but really it's about forming relationships and forming bonds of trust and a mutual targeting of the best opportunities we have to deliver new capabilities for the Department of the Navy moving forward.
Undersecretary of the Navy Erik Raven at Sea Air Space this week. You can read more about the budget request for fiscal 25 and find a link to the Navy and Marine Corps' budget hearings on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, the Pentagon gets serious about the defense industrial base's supply chain. FedGov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment. Here's John Salen, Vice President of Cyber Solutions at GDIT, from the program Zero Trust In-Depth, presented by GDIT.
I firmly believe that cybersecurity, particularly zero trust, but in general, it's not about compliance. It's not even really about IT. It's about meeting the mission objectives.
That's right.
And your focus on the outcomes, your focus on stopping the adversary is exactly right. Because for me, as a system developer, as a system builder, I would much rather have use cases. Tell me what you're trying to achieve. Don't give me a bunch of shall statements. And this approach is perfectly in line with that. Tell me what the outcomes are. Tell me what activities we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to stop the adversarial TTPs. And let's just go after it.
To learn more, go to fedgovtoday.com/in-depth. Welcome back. The Defense Department's cybersecurity maturity model certifications, only one example of the Pentagon's interest in the security and integrity of the supply chain of the defense industrial base. The department has a number of other DIB supply chain initiatives underway or under consideration, too. Jennifer Bisceglie is founder and CEO of Interos. At Sea Airspace this week, she tells me how the discussion about supply chain is changing in the defense industrial base.
I think that what I find very interesting about all of these conversations that is very, very different than 5-6 years ago is how reliant the reputation of these businesses are as far as their supply chain. So if you think about was pre-pandemic, you really didn't have a lot of people talking about supply chain. Now everyone has some sort of discussion around executing on the mission, and a large part of it is just fulfilling, the orders at the end of the day.
Yeah. What is driving that? Is it just that the department is so focused on that, or the companies, do you think, detecting something in their own operations and maybe in their own P&Ls about why they need to pay attention to the supply chain to the degree that they are now?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And to be honest with you, I think it's both. I think one is the department's not letting them off the hook. And the second is it's not good enough not to know anymore.
Yeah.
And I find that really eye-opening. Years ago, it was okay not to know. And now it's like, well, no, the pandemic was here. What are you waiting for? What are you waiting to invest in? And no longer is it good enough not to have the orders in time, multiple months out, because there's going to be some sort of an interruption that comes through.
What are the answers that those companies should be ready, willing, and able to provide to the department about the statuses of their supply chains, so the department can then have the confidence that it needs to have?
Yeah, I think so. We broke it down into 6 different areas of risk. One is financial. First and foremost, you got to understand financial. Second is cybersecurity. We talked a little bit about that earlier. The third is sustainability, ESG. Some people really pay attention to it. Some people don't, but you want to have it in front of you. And then we look at other things like geopolitical risk or restricted entities. Where are unfriendly or maybe not as friendly countries in your supply chain that could, on purpose or by accident, interrupt? And then the last one is this concept of catastrophic risk, which if you think about hurricane season and Hurricane Ian that decimated Florida years ago, how do I get ahead of what's happening out there? And not only do we see that in the private sector, but we actually see that not only do we see that in the private sector, but also in the public sector. Mm-hmm. And so if you think about what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine and you had 3,000 sanctions levied against Russia in 10 business days, every one of our customers on a Saturday were able to go to the platform to look at their environment themselves and answer that type of a question. That's pretty powerful.
So none of these terms are scientific. I made them all up in my head as we're having this conversation, but it strikes me there are a number of levels of information that one has on one's supply chain to then be able to supply to the department. Situational awareness, I at least know what everything is and where everything's coming from. Security, I have pretty much some comfort that I have things locked down and I'm not worried about supply chain issues.
Right.
And then the ultimate is I have complete control over that supply chain and I know everything is going to be solid for time immemorial. How far along does one need to be, though, to be able to go to the department with some confidence and say, I'm doing my part at least?
Yeah, I would say that they need to know, and they also need to be comfortable not knowing. Okay. And right, because it's really hard to predict the future. And so I want to understand, here's the perfect path, and here's what happens if that perfect path doesn't work. And I need to be ready for both.
Mm-hmm. Do traditional risk management practices apply to supply chain, or there are some that companies, especially in the defense industrial base, should think about, should apply to when they're making their evaluations?
I think it's a great question. there is no schooling for what we do, which people ask me this all the time. We actually created our own training data for the first time ever. And I think it's someplace in between, in that there are people that are classically trained for supply chain. You don't get rid of people being people, but you can also leverage technology. And I think that that's really the power that's out there. And that's really the investment. In Interos, we invested almost $300 million since 2019 in our technology in effort to move the conversation forward faster, because technology exists to do such a thing. And so I think we can take advantage of technology without having to hire a bunch of new people.
So what does the supply chain conversation look like when it's in its mature state at some point in the future?
Yeah, so we do a 4-step maturity process, everything from I'm not doing anything to I'm continuous monitoring. I would argue that most of us can get to continuous monitoring within 6 to 12 months. It doesn't take that long to get there, and technology just lets us get there faster.
You can read more about the defense industrial base supply chain at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, executing the vision for America's warfighting Navy. FedGov Today with Francis Rose continues in a moment. Here's Assembly Vice President of Global Sales, Peter Hancock, from Innovation in Government at HIMSS, presented by Carasoft.
So we were active in a proof of concept, a pilot for our technology with a hospital system in the last month or so. And we were kind of doing a readout to the head of security. And we said, we kind of hate to tell you this, but there's foreign nationals in your network right now. And he said, that's impossible. We said, well, there's a telnet session coming from Asia that they're traversing your network right now. And all of a sudden, they closed the door, stopped, and said, okay, we need to take action.
For more, go to innovationingov.com. Welcome back. The document called America's Warfighting Navy is that service's blueprint for the vision of the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti. She talked about it on FedGov Today recently. You can find that conversation in the archives at fedgovtoday.com. At Sea Air Space this week, the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral James Kilby, says his job is as the, quote, execution arm for the CNO.
And in that, it means how do I work with the different stakeholders across the board to make sure we're getting the results she desires. So that could be our nuclear shipyard maintenance system. Is that aligned to produce what it needs to produce? If not, why? What are we doing about it? It's Navy recruiting. Are we hitting our numbers? If not, why? Let's be thoughtful about that. Look at the data, hold ourselves accountable, and try to get after that. So I think that is probably a really good analogy.
We talked a little bit before we turned the cameras on about your desire to make the Navy a better learning organization. In what way and how will that manifest itself to the sailor on the front lines, the Marine on the front lines?
We've had some spectacular non-learning events, and I'll highlight one for you as for example. One is the fire on the USS Miami where we lost that submarine. It was a fire in a shipyard, and as a result, we struck that submarine from the record. And similarly, most recently, we've had the same event happen on USS Bonhomme Richard. Different causal factors, but the same result. And in between, we wrote a pretty in-depth instruction called the 80-10 to try to prevent that from happening, which it didn't. So why did that occur? Did we write the instruction in a manner that it's easily digestible by the various organizations that have to execute it? And are we holding ourselves accountable to the types of behavior and check and balance you need to not put yourself in that position where we lose a ship? So we cannot afford to do that. And I want to reverse that for the CNO and make us a better learning organization so we're not in a position to try to relearn, if that makes sense.
Yes. How do you individually and how do you as a Navy reorganize, reorient, re-strategize, or whatever is necessary to get to that point? And how will you know when you're there and just building momentum?
I hope we never say we're there. I hope we say we're closer there than we needed to be. A lot of times in these events, we found clouded command and control. Like there's multiple people that are involved, but nobody singly and responsible. We don't always do a good job of understanding what the standard of performance is and what our actual performance is against that standard. And then once you know those things, you can plot a course to correct and get better. So there's an accountability and a day-to-day functionality of how we do our jobs that I think we can do better. And this structure we're implementing through a process called Perform to Plan is aimed to do that.
One of the theaters of operation where you have an opportunity to learn a lot is in the Red Sea right now. What are you taking away from that, and how are you analyzing what sailors are doing there to apply to concepts of readiness, concepts of training, hardware performance, all those kinds of things?
Thanks for that question, Francis. First of all, the Ike strike group is doing great. That means the air wing and the ships. Talk about the destroyers a lot, but there's fighters in F-18s that are knocking cruise missiles down and UAVs down, as well as ships. I think the aviation community has done a better job at data reconstruction in the past, and they do that through a process called PBED, plan, brief, execute, debrief. And we haven't always been as responsive in the surface side. In this specific effort, we've really shortened the amount of time it takes to take a data reduction from the Aegis combat system, get it off the ship, analyze it, and return that for consumption from the crew and multiple crews. So did the Aegis system perform as designed? Yes or no? If it didn't, do we need to fix something in the Aegis system? A. B, did the operators perform as they should have against the tactics, techniques, and procedures we had in place? And if they didn't, let's correct that and then teach that. And if all that worked, we need to have an adjustment for the system. But if you wait weeks, people forget what they did and they kind of get foggy on it. So it's this time is of the essence. And we've really cracked that code working with industry, the Navy, and our warfighting development centers to do that. And I think that's a key to learning as well.
You've mentioned data a couple of times in this conversation. You spoke about it here. I've seen you speak about it before. What's your sense of how the Navy is doing at becoming a data-driven organization?
I think we're doing better. I think we've got a ways to go. I mean, so we have to be thoughtful about what the data source is. The term of art, I think, is an authoritative data source, so you can trust that. But once you have that data, are we being thoughtful about how we use that data? At what currency do we need to look at it? And I want people to ask, Francis, if I say, are we winning today? And that can happen on the factory floor. It can happen in the combat system of a ship. I want them to be able to understand and say, yes. And so that's using data and holding ourselves to a standard to achieve an outcome that I don't think we've always been disciplined about.
What improves that in your view? What is the enterprise view of the Navy in improving that, and what do you, in your capacity as VCNO, what can you do to drive that, do you think?
One view is, am I using daily visual management of data to help my decision making? And typically when we get in this conversation, we think more is better and more is not better. Because if I'm looking at 50 things, I probably can't make sense of it. But if you look at some of our top performing companies out there, they've got a handful of metrics that they measure against day in and day out, 365 days a year. And that becomes their ability to guide whether they're on track or off track. So choosing those metrics, exposing our workforce to those metrics, and then holding ourselves accountable to those metrics, I think, is what I'm talking about.
Okay, so when you frame it in that way, then I'm going to take you back to America's warfighting Navy, because then you have three metrics right there.
Sure.
How the Navy is doing in warfighting, or readiness for warfighting, warfighters, and foundation. Am I on the right track?
Yes, you are. And it applies to all of them. There's overlap between those three pillars. I think in the war fighting capability, are my systems doing what they think they should do? In the war fighter capability, the two metrics might be, am I retaining and am I recruiting at the level I need to have a healthy organization? Those are some metrics that are used by successful organizations. And then for the foundation, is the foundation doing what it needs to do to produce those two first categories? So the foundation is an element that supports both of those.
When you come to a show like this, there's a lot of terrific displays here, a lot to see. How do you decide what you're going to take back to the Pentagon and think about, do something with? And how do you communicate with industry when you're here, beyond saying the things that you and your colleagues have said on stage? We need your help, we rely on the partnerships, all true. What's deeper than that in your view, and in the way that you connect with industry?
Well, I don't know that I may come with a game plan. I may say I want to go see this person or that person or this company or that company. But in general, I want to be open to the experience because everyone I've found in general wants to do a good job and believes they have a product worthwhile to the Navy. So I'm trying to be open to that experience here. And then if I commit to closing a loop, I'm going to close that loop. So when I ask for your card, I'm going to close and connect two people with an email or ask you in for a meeting or try to understand that space better. It's not a commitment to do it. It is a commitment to understand. And therefore, you've engendered an environment that's healthy.
You can read more about America's warfighting Navy and the programs Admiral Kilby talked about on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. FedGov Today continues in just a moment.
Explore the power of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and digital innovations in healthcare. Watch Innovation in Government from HIMSS, available on demand. Learn from leaders at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Defense Health Agency, and more. Don't miss this exclusive insight into the future of government and healthcare innovation. Watch anytime at fedgovtoday.com or the FedGov Today YouTube channel, sponsored by Carasoft.
Welcome back. In today's event spotlight, climate change will be in focus at the next ACT-IAC Summit. It's coming this Wednesday, April 17th, at the Carasoft Conference and Collaboration Center in Reston. Federal government leaders from civilian and military departments will review the action their agencies are taking to deal with and mitigate the effects of climate change. You can read more about it and register at fedgovtoday.com/events. FedGov Today TV returns next Sunday morning at 10:30 with a full cadre of IT leaders from the Department of the Air Force, led by CIO Venus Goodwine. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks very much for watching. Have a great week.
Here's John Salin, Vice President of Cyber Solutions at GDIT, from the program Zero Trust In Depth, presented by GDIT.
You know, I firmly believe that cybersecurity, particularly zero trust, but in general, it's not about compliance. It's not even really about IT. It's about meeting the mission objectives.
That's right.
And your focus on the outcomes, your focus on stopping the adversary is exactly right. Because for me, as a system developer, as a system builder, I would much rather have use cases. Tell me what you're trying to achieve. Don't give me a bunch of shall statements. And this approach is perfectly in line with that. Tell me what the outcomes are. Tell me what activities we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to stop the adversarial TTPs. And let's just go after it.
To learn more, go to fedgovtoday.com/in-depth.